What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and we continue our 2022 early projected record series and also previewing the schedules for each team here. Oregon is up next, a team coming off of a really good season, even though it didn't finish the way they wanted it to. Remember, they beat Ohio State. They went 10-2 in the regular season, so that regular season was a really good one for Oregon, but just didn't finish the way they wanted to, losing in the Pac-12 championship game, and then of course the bowl game as well. So before we get to 2022, let's look back at 2021. Here is the schedule for Oregon in 2021. You see, of course, the big non-conference game against Ohio State. They also played Fresno State and Stony Brook in the non-conference, so not a horrible non-conference schedule. Look at who they played out of the Pac-12 South. They had to play Utah on the road. That wound up being, the best team out of the South, so that was a tough draw there. They also had to play UCLA on the road, a pretty tough game that they were able to win. They had Arizona and Colorado, but all in all, the Ohio State game makes this schedule tougher just because of the fact that you're playing a big non-conference game like that. But other than that, the schedule wasn't horrible for Oregon last year. The Pac-12 North wasn't very good, so that helped them out as well to have an easier schedule. But again, you look back to last season, and if you had told me that Oregon was going to beat Ohio State, that they would finish with 4 losses, I would have told you you're crazy. Of course, 2 of those losses coming in the postseason, in the Pac-12 championship, and then in their bowl game. But that loss to Stanford really hurt them as well, knocked them out of playoff contention, even going into that Pac-12 championship game. But let's look at 2022. Here is the schedule. And of course, the big game is that game against Georgia. That jumps out right away, week 1. Before we go game by game, let's look at who they play outside of the division. We start with the non-conference games. Of course, that game against Georgia, just mentioned it, in Atlanta, basically a road game. Then they'll play Eastern Washington and BYU. BYU is expected to be a top 25, top 15 possibly team this year, so that is a tough non-conference schedule. Georgia and BYU, a very tough non-conference schedule. Then you look at who they play out of the Pac-12 South. They'll play Arizona on the road, UCLA on the road at Colorado, and then Utah. So you have to play Utah again. That's going to be tough. Don't have to play USC. That's, I guess, good news because that's a team that could be dangerous this year. You want to play Arizona. You want to play Colorado. You do get Utah at home. But all in all, when you're talking about Georgia and BYU in the non-conference and then Utah out of the Pac-12 South, those are some tough games that aren't even in your division. So here is the schedule again. They open up with that game against Georgia in Atlanta, September the 3rd. Then they'll play Eastern Washington, and then they'll play BYU on the 17th. So their 3 non-conference games are the first 3 games of the season. Then they get into conference play with Washington State on the road September 24th. Then Stanford on October the 1st, Arizona October the 8th, UCLA on October the 22nd. So their bye week will be between Arizona and UCLA right there in the middle of the season. Then they'll play Cal on the road on October the 29th, Colorado on the road November the 5th. Back-to-back road games there. Washington on November 12th, then Utah on the 19th, and Oregon State on the 25th. I think Oregon State's kind of a sleeper team in the Pac-12 North. So with Utah and Oregon State there at the end, those are 2 very tough games to close out the season. Plus you have the Georgia and BYU games in September. I think the middle of the schedule is pretty easy for Oregon. Yeah, there are games you could trip up. Cal on the road won't be an easy win, but the middle of that schedule isn't too bad. It's the beginning. It's Georgia and BYU in those first 3 weeks, and then Utah and Oregon State, possibly Washington if they turn things around. The beginning and the end, that's where the tough part of the schedule is for Oregon, in my opinion. If they can get past, let's say they lose to Georgia and beat BYU, if they can get through that middle portion of the schedule, they could possibly be going into that Utah game with just 1 loss and really still in playoff contention. So it starts with those 2 big non-conference games, and then it ends with 2 huge conference games in Utah and Oregon State. But all in all, a pretty tough schedule for a Pac-12 team is what we've got here with Oregon in 2022. Here are the projections from 2021. This team went 10-2 in the regular season, and we're just comparing the regular season here. Of course, Oregon actually was 10-4, but regular season they were 10-2. Our projection had them at 9-3. My personal prediction was actually 10-2, so I was right on the money with this team. The FBI had them at 9.8 and 3.0, so I had them right around 9-3, same as our projection. And Vegas also had them at 9, the over/under at 9. So they thought that this team would go right around 9-3. So not a huge shock that they were 10-2, just a little bit better than maybe the projection. But they did beat the projection last year, going 10-2, and I think they're going to beat the projection again this year, and I'll kind of explain why in just a second. So this is not a prediction. We are a long ways away from doing our official predictions, but this is simply a projection based off of how tough the schedule is and how good we think or expect each team will be this upcoming season. So here's the schedule again. This is the scale that we use. If it's a 50-50 game, it'll say in the white, less than 20%, over 80%. Those are games where I think the spread will be more than 2 touchdowns. Then you've got your 20-29, 71-80% games. Those are games where I think the spread will be double digits, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that range. Not a huge spread. Definitely a game a team could lose if they're a favorite. And then you have your yellow, 30-39, and purple, 61-70%. Those are games where I think a team is going to be favored by about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points, somewhere in that range. And then, again, those 50-50 games, they're not necessarily 50-50 games, but they are games where I think the spread would be like 3 or 4 points or less than that. So for Oregon, we start with the easy wins. They've only got one, and that's why this projection is probably going to be lower than you expect. Because we do have to put some games in the blue. I don't think there are any games besides Eastern Washington that we could put in the green. Just because of some of these other teams in the Pac-12, they're not going to be terrible. And where they play some of them also makes it a little bit tricky for Oregon. And I think that is going to pull this projection down. And what I'm talking about here is with Washington State, Arizona, and Colorado. So these are games that where if they were at home, I'd probably have them in the green. And if they were in the green, then they would all be counted as wins, and that would obviously make the projection much better. But I think because they're on the road, they are conference games. Arizona, a team that should be a little bit better. Colorado is kind of a mystery. So same thing with Washington State. But I think these teams are good enough, whereas I think it's close to 80%, but because they're on the road, I think we're going to put these in the blue and put them in that 71 to 80% range. And then you go to the next category, 61 to 70%. We've got Stanford, UCLA, Cal, and Washington all in this. Stanford, of course, beat Oregon last year, but I feel like Oregon will be the better team this year. Oregon's a mystery, of course. A lot of guys going out, transfers, some new guys coming in, new coaching staff. Bo Nix at quarterback. What's he going to look like? I mean, a lot of question marks. But Oregon, talent-wise, is expected to be a top 25 team. And so I think they should be favored against Stanford. Should be favored against UCLA. This one was a tough one for me. UCLA has a lot of transfers coming in. They could be better. They had their ups and downs last year. At one point, UCLA was ranked in the top 25. Remember, they beat LSU early in the year. And so it's hard to say for sure how this UCLA team is going to be. But I can go ahead and tell you, if I put this in the 50-50 range, it would not change the projection. So I did look at that. But because it's at home, I'm going to put it in the purple. Cal, I think, was better than their record would indicate last year. This game is also on the road. I think that's a purple game. Washington, I think, was also a little bit better than their record would suggest. They had some close games. So I think playing at home, it gives Oregon an advantage, but not a huge advantage. I think they will be favored by about a touchdown. And then you got your underdog games. You got Utah. I think they're going to be underdogs by about a touchdown. Of course, last year wasn't really even close. It is at home for Oregon. That gives them a chance, but I do think they will be underdogs in that game. And then also you've got Georgia. Georgia I've got in the orange here. I have to go all the way out to Atlanta. I'm not going to say they have no chance, but I do expect them to be 10 to 14 point underdogs in this one, somewhere in that range. I know Georgia has a lot of turnover, but they've got a lot of talent, and this will be a tough game for Oregon to win. And then that leaves BYU and Oregon State. BYU has a ton of production coming back. This should be a close game. I would think. If I had to pick, I would say Oregon, and I'd probably say that they're about a 4-point favorite in this game, but I think it's just low enough to where we can keep this game in that 50-50 category. And then Oregon State. Oregon State's a team that I think is going to surprise some people this year. A lot coming back. The game is on the road. It's a rivalry game. Because of all of that, I think we have to put this one in the white as well. I do think this will be a 50-50 game. And like I said, just a lot of question marks with Oregon, a lot of unknowns. What will this team look like? It's hard to say, and that's why it's hard to do a projection this early. But when we average all the numbers out, we count Eastern Washington as a win, then we average everything out. The white's considered at 50%, the purple at 65, the blue at 75. Average those games out. Again, this projection is going to seem low, but it's just how it comes out. 7-5, a 7-5 projected record for Oregon. if you put Washington State, Arizona, and Colorado in the green, that's probably going to pull this up to 8-4, maybe even 9-3. But because of those games that Oregon should win, but they're just not quite, there's not quite enough there for me to put those in the green because they're playing them on the road. I think that is probably why this projection came out to 7-5. But you look at, if they lose to Georgia and they lose to Utah, they split with BYU and Oregon State. That's 3 losses right there. And out of the rest of these games, they could definitely lose 2 more, even though they will be favored. So I could see this team going 7-5, but I think 8-4 is probably a more realistic projection. And it was so close. When you average the numbers out, it was actually like 7.46 wins or something like that. So it was very close to being 8-4. I almost just put 8-4 on the projection just because they're favored in so many games. But to keep this going the same way we've been doing with every team, 7-5 is the projection for Oregon. I think the Ducks will be looking to do better than that for sure. So what do you guys think? Do you think this projection is low like I kind of do? Or maybe you think it's right on the money. Maybe you think this team will be 7-5. Give me your thoughts down in the comments below.